Good evening, everyone. I hope this message finds you in a moment of peace and clarity wherever you may be watching from across America and around the world. Tonight, I want to speak to you with a tone that cuts through the noise, because something extraordinary is unfolding in Africa. Something that is shaking the very foundations of global power, and yet so few people in Washington are paying any attention at all. Across the Sahel, from the streets of Bamako to the heart of Ouagadougou to the corridors of Niamey, a new force is rising with a fire the world thought had been extinguished long ago. Africa, once treated as nothing more than a chessboard for great powers to play their games upon, is now flipping that entire board. And standing at the center of this turning tide is a young leader whose name echoes across headlines and whispers through foreign policy rooms here in the United States. Many of you have asked about Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, and tonight we will touch on his vision. But our story begins in Mali, at an event the Western media barely mentioned, yet one that may completely rewrite the future security map of an entire continent. BAMEX 2025, the International Defense and Security Exhibition, held in Bamako, was not just a showcase of weapons and military hardware. It was a declaration of autonomy, a signal flare rising into the night sky, announcing to the world that Africa will no longer rent its security from outsiders. And here is the first shock of the evening that should make every strategist in Washington sit up and take notice. If Africa is learning to arm itself without permission, who loses control first? What you are about to hear about drones striking with the force of fighter jets, about a unified Sahel military command structure, about African nations designing their own defense future will challenge the old assumptions many Americans have held for decades. Because this is not just Mali's story. And it is not just Burkina Faso's story. This is the story of an entire continent, stepping onto the world stage, with armor forged in sovereignty, and the implications reach far beyond the Sahel. Stay with me, because the truth becomes even more startling from here. The story of BAMEX 2025 begins far earlier than when the cameras started rolling, long before the speeches were delivered, and long before the exhibition halls filled with the metallic scent of freshly oiled machinery. It begins with 15 years of unanswered violence. Villages burned to ash, borders collapsing under pressure, and foreign militaries circling the Sahel like hawks, claiming to protect, yet leaving the heart of the region bleeding and broken. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger lived through a cycle of insecurity that felt endless, that felt like a curse, with no cure. Many Americans who served abroad remember those headlines vividly, the reports of extremist groups spreading like wildfire, the sense that this region was perpetually on the brink. But something changed, something fundamental that shifted beneath the surface. When Mali opened the doors to the International Defense and Security Exhibition BAMEX 2025, it marked the first time in modern African history that a Sahel nation hosted a full-scale, world-class defense expo, built not on dependency, but on sovereign intent and indigenous capability. The Bamako Exhibition Center transformed overnight into a fortress of innovation and military prowess. Rows upon rows of unmanned aerial systems, advanced munitions, precision optics, ballistic armor, and weapon platforms usually seen only at industrial expos in Ankara, Moscow, or Washington filled the vast space. Military officers from across the continent moved through the corridors with notebooks and steel-hard posture, examining every detail with the eyes of professionals, evaluating future partnerships. Engineers in lab coats explained recoil patterns, discussed micro-drone swarms, and demonstrated targeting systems with a confidence that surprised many foreign observers. African presidents walked side by side with defense strategists, their presence sending an unmistakable message. Everything about the atmosphere said one thing loud and clear: Africa is preparing to defend itself with dignity, intelligence, and technological might that rivals anything the world has seen. But nothing, absolutely nothing, captured global attention like the drone demonstration that occurred on the exhibition floor. When an interviewer asked a seemingly simple question, "What is the capability of this drone?" the answer that came back shook even seasoned military analysts to their core. This drone has capabilities similar to cargo aircraft. It strikes like the F-16, and yes, it drops bombs. Those words sliced through the conversation like a siren cutting through silence. Suddenly, the old comfortable idea that Africa only imported technology, that it only consumed what others produced, evaporated into thin air. If a region once dismissed as perpetually unstable is now fielding platforms comparable to Western-made strike aircraft, what does that mean for the future balance of power? What does it mean for long-standing American influence in the Sahel, an area Washington has quietly considered essential to its strategic interests since the early 2000s? Here is where the shock deepens even further, and I need you to understand the magnitude of this shift. If drones built through African alliances and partnerships begin to match the strike capability of U.S. fighter jet doctrine, does Washington even recognize the tectonic shift that is taking place beneath its feet? Across the expo floor, Turkish engineers stood shoulder to shoulder with their African counterparts, explaining the intricate architecture of guidance systems, discussing the weight distribution of airframes, and sharing the tactical doctrine behind low-altitude strike routes. But the real story was not the equipment itself, as impressive as it was. The real story was the message being sent to the world. Turkey did not show up as a commander giving orders. It showed up as a partner offering respect, something many Africans say the West never offered sincerely in all the decades of so-called cooperation and aid programs. Every single aisle of BAMEX told the same powerful narrative. Cartridges manufactured right there in Mali. Ballistic vests developed inside the region for African terrain and African needs. A munitions company that had been operating in the country for 25 years, quietly exporting across West Africa, finally stepping into the light and showing the world what it had built. Their representative said something that struck a nerve with everyone who heard it. This exhibition should have happened a long time ago. For the first time, we can really show what we are capable of. That sentence carries enormous weight because capability, true indigenous capability, changes the entire geopolitical equation. It shifts leverage, it redistributes power, and it forces old players to reconsider their strategies completely. What impressed observers even more than the hardware on display was the visible presence of the Sahel Confederation leadership standing together in solidarity. Assimi Goïta of Mali, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, and Abdourahmane Chiani of Niger, three commanders once surrounded and constrained by foreign-imposed narratives, now standing shoulder to shoulder, presenting their own unified vision to the world. Their alliance, which formed first as the Alliance of Sahel States and later transformed into the Confederation of Sahel States, is no longer a theoretical construct or a diplomatic talking point. It is operational, it is real, and BAMEX was their declaration of readiness to the entire international community. Visitors moved through stands displaying assault rifles, platforms chambered in standard calibers, pistols, grenade launchers, and new generation tactical drones that would make any military planner stop and recalculate their assumptions. But what took many foreign observers by surprise was not the hardware itself. It was the calm confidence radiating from African officers who were no longer looking for rescue or waiting for instructions. They were evaluating partnerships on their own terms, comparing manufacturing standards with professional scrutiny, and deciding, not being told, what their armies would become in the years ahead. For decades, the global narrative portrayed the Sahel as a place where all the important decisions were made by outsiders, where African voices were secondary at best. But the moment you stepped into BAMEX 2025, that comfortable illusion shattered like thin glass hitting concrete. Africa belongs to Africans, one official stated plainly, not as a slogan shouted for applause, but as a fact backed by hardware lined across 10,000 square feet of exhibition space. The presence of 15 invited nations, including strategic observers from Morocco, Iran, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, added a wider layer of international consequence to the entire event. This was not an isolated moment. It was a signal broadcast across continents, a message transmitted loud and clear that the era of Africa as a passive recipient of military doctrine and foreign security strategies is ending, and ending rapidly. And then came perhaps the most symbolic gesture of all, one that revealed the deeper purpose behind BAMEX. the expo was opened to the public. Ordinary civilians, men and women, even elderly citizens, walked the aisles, touching the vests, inspecting the rifles with curiosity, standing beneath the shadow of drones shaped like metallic hawks suspended from the ceiling. The government wanted them to feel something visceral and real: resilience, ownership, pride in their nation's capability. Because a population that understands its own defense becomes significantly harder to manipulate, harder to intimidate, and harder to weaken from the outside. Which leads us to the next profound shock for those of us watching carefully from afar. When a population stops fearing outside threats because it trusts its own strength, it stops obeying outside powers and their demands. This is not simply about military equipment. It is about a psychological transformation sweeping across an entire region. BAMEX 2025 was not just an exhibition of guns and drones. It was the physical manifestation of a psychological shift that has been building for years. A shift from dependency to sovereignty, from fear to confidence, from following to leading. And Americans, especially those who have worn a uniform and understand the weight of these moments, recognize how rare and powerful such transformations truly are. This is only the beginning of something much larger, sweeping across the Sahel. And the events that unfold in the coming months and years will shape not only Africa's trajectory, but America's strategic future in ways most policymakers have not yet begun to grasp. From Washington's perspective, the rise of a confident, self-armed Sahel is far more than a regional development to be noted in intelligence briefings. It is a strategic jolt to the entire framework of American foreign policy in Africa. For 2 decades, the United States approached the Sahel almost exclusively through the lens of counterterrorism operations. Military advisors, intelligence outposts, drone bases, and billions in foreign assistance programs became the backbone of America's presence in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Policymakers in Washington genuinely believed that maintaining influence in this belt of Africa was absolutely essential to keeping extremist threats away from global trade corridors and Western interests. But BAMEX 2025 sent a very different message, one that many American analysts were simply not prepared to hear or accept. The Sahel is no longer a region defined by dependency on outside powers. It is a region actively defining itself on its own terms, building its own institutions. And that transformation disrupts every familiar strategic assumption Washington has relied upon. AFRICOM, headquartered in Stuttgart but deeply invested in Sahel operations for years, now faces a landscape that does not look remotely the way it did 5 or even 3 years ago. Where U.S. forces once trained local battalions and provided operational guidance, the Sahel Confederation now trains itself with its own unified command structure. Where American advisors once guided large-scale counterterrorism missions and shaped tactical decisions, unified command structures led by African officers are taking over completely. Where Washington once believed it fundamentally shaped the rules of engagement and set the strategic direction, African-led doctrines are now rewriting those rules from the ground up. And hovering over all of this transformation is a growing, uncomfortable question circulating through American strategic circles that few want to say out loud. If the United States loses the Sahel, what part of Africa falls out of the American sphere of influence next? In geopolitics, influence rarely disappears quietly or all at once. It moves, it shifts, it flows, like water finding new channels. When one power steps back or is pushed back, another power inevitably steps in to fill that vacuum. And Turkey has stepped in decisively, offering not just weapon sales, but genuine technology transfer, co-production facilities, industrial partnerships, and most importantly, political respect for African sovereignty. This is not the transactional, condescending model Africa has experienced for decades from Western powers. This is a fundamentally different model built on shared sovereignty and mutual advantage, and Africans across the continent recognize the difference immediately and appreciate it deeply. Meanwhile, Russia has successfully leveraged security contracts and political alliances across multiple Sahel nations, China continues its relentless expansion of economic footprint through infrastructure financing and energy projects that bind countries closer, and Europe struggles desperately to maintain any relevance as its migration concerns and fears shape policy far more than any genuine commitment to long-term African stability. The United States is now confronting a reality it did not anticipate, and certainly did not plan for: a Sahel that is not only shifting its alliances away from Washington, but actively reshaping the global balance of power in the process. And here is where the shock resonates most clearly for American viewers and policymakers alike. When a region no longer needs American protection, it no longer accepts American direction or interference in its internal affairs. This is not hostility toward the United States. This is sovereignty. The same sovereignty that Americans themselves defend fiercely and consider sacred. My prediction is straightforward and carries significant weight. The Sahel is rapidly becoming one of the most consequential strategic regions of the 21st century, not because foreign powers have designated it as important, but because African nations are building the tools, the alliances, and the industries that allow them to declare their own importance and back it up with real capability. And now I want to turn this question directly back to you, because your perspective and your voice matter more than ever in this moment of global transformation. Tell me this honestly: is America truly prepared for a Sahel that no longer needs us? That no longer waits for our approval? That charts its own course regardless of what Washington thinks? Share your thoughts below. Speak openly, speak truthfully, and add your voice to this critical moment of change that is reshaping our world. Because this conversation does not end here with this video. In fact, it is only beginning, and what happens next will determine the future of an entire continent and America's place in the world.